History isn't just stories of glory and heroism, it's also filled with chilling acts of cruelty that leave us speechless. Ancient wars, brutal as they were, often brought out the darkest sides of humanity. From mass massacres to unimaginable punishments, these war crimes weren't just strategies. They were meant to instill fear and crush entire civilizations. Join us as we uncover the most shocking war crimes ever recorded in ancient history. Number 8. Siege of Tyre. It was the autumn of 333 before Christ, and Alexander the Great had just secured a major victory at the Battle of Issus. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of Persian soldiers, the shattered remains of King Darius III's army. But Alexander wasn't satisfied with just a win. He was determined to crush Darius's influence entirely. His next target was Tyre, an island city in Phoenicia. Tyre, now located in Lebanon, wasn't just any city. It was a powerful fortress and a key symbol of Persian control. Leaving it unconquered wasn't an option. But the people of Tyre weren't about to give in easily. At first, Alexander tried to negotiate. He asked for permission to enter Tyre's temple of Heracles, framing it as a gesture of goodwill. The Tyrians weren't fooled. They rejected his request and took things a step further by unaliving his envoys and dumping their bodies into the sea. That act pushed Alexander over the edge. Furious, he destroyed the mainland settlement of Tyre, known as Old Tyre, and prepared for a massive siege. The problem was Tyre wasn't easy to get to. It was an island, separated from the coast by about 700 meters of open water. With limited ships at his disposal, Alexander had to think outside the box. He ordered his men to build a giant causeway out of the rubble from Old Tyre. The work was slow, and the Tyrians didn't make it any easier. They attacked with everything they had, even setting a fire ship packed with flammable materials loose to destroy Macedonian siege towers. But Alexander wasn't one to give up. He widened the causeway and called in reinforcements, bringing in more than 200 ships from allies in Phoenicia and Cyprus. Once Alexander had control of the seas, the tide of the battle turned. He launched attacks from both the land and the water. The Tyrians didn't back down, though. They fought hard, launching surprise raids and sabotaging Macedonian ships by cutting their anchor cables. But eventually, Alexander's battering rams broke through the city's defenses and his troops poured in. What happened next was brutal. After months of fighting and frustration, Alexander's soldiers took their anger out on the Tyrians. Thousands were executed as the Macedonians rampaged through the city. People tried to find safety wherever they could. Young children and women ran to the temples, hoping for mercy, while Tyrian men fought to the death in the streets and on rooftops. By the end, about 8,000 Tyrians were dead. Macedonian losses were reported to be only 400, though that number is hard to believe. The survivors, roughly 30,000 men, women, and children, were rounded up and sold into slavery. Even after the fighting stopped, Alexander's anger hadn't cooled. To send a message, he had 2,000 Tyrian men crucified along the shoreline as the survivors witnessed the death of their fellow fighters. And then Alexander's army burned the city of Tyre to the ground. Experts believe that Alexander's violence was both unnecessary and excessive, as he had already won the city. But rage and anger got the better of him. Now onto the topic of the dark period of Assyrian brutality that took millions of lives. Number 7. Brutality of the Assyrians. Assyrian history, as preserved in inscriptions and artwork, stands as one of the bloodiest in the ancient world, and for good reasons. Emerging in the 14th century before Christ, Assyria began as a territorial state in what is now northern Iraq. Its first capital, Assur, located about 150 miles north of modern Baghdad, was named after the empire's national god, Assur, who also gave the empire its name. From the outset, Assyria built its reputation as a military powerhouse. Conquest was its defining purpose, and resistance to Assyrian rule was met with merciless punishment. Cities were burned, fields destroyed, and orchards leveled, leaving entire regions in ruin. These acts were not only strategic, but symbolic, emphasizing Assyrian dominance and the divine will of their god. The Assyrians proudly documented their campaigns, detailing the destruction they unleashed. They were masters of psychological warfare, and their royal inscriptions paint a chilling picture of how they dealt with enemies. Their brutal king, Ashurnasirpal II, didn't just conquer cities, he made examples of them. In his own words, he called himself the trampler of all enemies, and boasted of hanging the bodies of his foes on posts for all to see. If a city surrendered quickly, its leaders would throw themselves at the king's mercy, begging, "If it pleases you, kill. If it pleases you, spare. Do what you will." But woe to those who defied him. In one brutal case, when a city held out too long, Ashurnasirpal recorded his darm retribution. He flayed rebellious nobles, draping their skins over a pile of dead bodies. He also turned their skins into macabre trophies, using them as decorative material. And it didn't stop there. After defeating an army, Ashurnasirpal described executing 50 soldiers with swords, burning 200 captives alive, and unaliving hundreds more in the heat of battle. He dyed the mountains red with their blood and filled ravines with their bodies. Survivors fared little better. Their heads were severed to build towers outside the cities, while others were impaled or burned. In one conquest, 3,000 fighters were executed, and captives were subjected to horrors. Limbs were cut off, noses and ears mutilated, and eyes gouged out. The cruelty continued with his successors. Sennacherib, infamous for his campaigns, faced betrayal in the end, murdered by his own sons. Esarhaddon, his heir, picked up where his father left off. When he captured the king of Sidon, he proudly declared, "Like a fish, I caught him out of the sea and executed him." To celebrate, he hung the heads of conquered kings on the shoulders of their nobles and paraded through Nineveh to music and song. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, took things even further. He didn't just unalive his enemies, he humiliated them. Some captives were dismembered and fed to dogs, pigs, and birds. Streets and squares were clogged with the remains of the dead, which were later removed and dumped onto massive heaps. Those spared from death faced a different kind of horror. Ashurbanipal pierced their lips and paraded them as living trophies through the streets of Assyria. This sort of brutality can only be paralleled by the heinous war crimes committed in Carthage. Number 6. Siege of Carthage. The Third Punic War, which started in 149 before Common Era, was a brutal conflict between Rome and Carthage. The Roman senator Cato the Censor is often quoted for his famous phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed," which echoed throughout Roman politics. This sentiment set the stage for the war, fueled by Rome's deep resentment over the harm caused by the Carthaginian general Hannibal during the Second Punic War. By the time the Third Punic War began, Carthage had already been weakened. The city was still alive, but it was a shadow of its former self, no longer a serious threat. However, the Romans were bent on wiping it out completely. The immediate cause of the war was Carthage's defense against an attack from Numidia, which was a violation of the terms Rome had imposed on the city. This gave Rome the excuse it needed to declare war. Carthage had a population of about 700,000, which included refugees from surrounding areas, and the city's defenses were still tough. For 3 years, Rome laid siege to Carthage, building siege engines, battering rams and other war machines to break through the city's walls. Despite their efforts, Carthage's defenders put up a fierce resistance, but they were outmatched by Rome's military power. In the end, the Romans broke through the walls and began a brutal assault on the city. The defenders, including men, women, and even children who fought to protect their homes, were executed. It's estimated that 50,000 people were executed in the final attack, with many others enslaved. Survivors were rounded up and sold into slavery. After the city was taken, the Romans destroyed Carthage completely. They demolished buildings, burned temples, and salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. Carthage was wiped off the map. The destruction of Carthage was one of the most extreme examples of war crimes in ancient history. The Romans didn't just defeat their enemy, they erased their civilization. What was once one of the most powerful cities in the Mediterranean was reduced to rubble, and its people were either executed or enslaved. Let's now talk about the dark legacy of holy wars. Number 5. The Bloodiest Crusade War. Believe it or not, the world's most brutal and bloody war campaigns were carried out in the name of God. The Crusades, known for its terror and mass executions, is one of the earliest examples of genocide in our ancient history. The Cathars, also known as Albigensians, were a religious group that lived in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They followed a dualistic belief system, seeing the world as the creation of an evil god, in contrast to a good god who embodied spiritual purity. Emerging between the years 1000 and 1050, they formed their own church around the year 1140, and by the late 12th century they had spread widely, establishing strongholds in the Languedoc region. The Cathars rejected the divinity of Christ and the authority of the Pope, which led the Roman Catholic Church to declare them heretics in the year 1176. Pope Innocent III initially sent missionaries to convert the Cathars, but escalated the situation into a full-scale war after one of his legates, Pierre of Castelnau, was murdered in January of the year 1208. The Pope then called for a crusade against the Cathars, promising that the soldiers would be able to keep any land seized from heretics. In the year 1209, an army of around 10,000 men, led by Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux, marched from Lyon to Béziers, a city that had a significant Cathar population. Upon arriving at Béziers, the Crusaders demanded the surrender of both Cathars and Catholics loyal to them. The city's defenders made a sortie, attacking the Crusaders, but were quickly overwhelmed. The city's gates were thrown open, and the Crusaders flooded in, committing an indiscriminate massacre. As the mass execution unfolded, Arnaud Amalric, the papal legate, infamously responded to a question about how to distinguish Catholics from heretics by saying, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." The death toll in Béziers was horrific, with estimates suggesting that between 15,000 and 20,000 people were executed, regardless of age, sex, or religious affiliation. The massacre spread to the city's churches, where victims, including those holding relics or crucifixes in desperation, were executed in cold blood. The violence went unchecked by the knights and bishops commanding the crusade. They allowed the camp followers, often made up of unsanctioned soldiers, to wreak havoc across the city. The massacres continued even as the city's buildings were looted and set on fire. Only when the looters began setting fire to the valuable property did the knights intervene, but by then, much of Béziers had been reduced to ashes. The fall of Béziers marked a turning point in the crusade, with many Catholics abandoning the Cathars, either by converting or collaborating with the Crusaders. The Cathars' strongholds in the region crumbled. Many Cathar communities were destroyed, their castles burned, and their followers either executed or driven out. The Albigensian Crusade continued for years after Béziers, targeting Cathar populations throughout the south of France. The Pope's campaign effectively eliminated the Cathars as a major religious and political force in the region. The sheer violence could only be matched by one brutal ruler from Mongolia. Number 4. The Terror of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, originally named Temujin, was born in the rugged mountains of northern Mongolia in the year 1162. His rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary, and by the year 1206, he had united the Mongol tribes and founded the Mongol Empire, which he would rule until his death in the year 1227. His reign is marked not only by remarkable military genius, but also by the sheer brutality with which he expanded his empire across Asia. One of the most horrific episodes of his conquests occurred in February of the year 1221, when his forces laid siege to the city of Merv, in what is now modern-day Turkmenistan. The people of Merv, faced with overwhelming Mongol force, chose to surrender, but the Mongols offered them no mercy. Instead, they unleashed a savage assault that virtually wiped the city off the map. Khan, ever the strategic commander, is said to have watched the carnage unfold from a golden throne, observing as captured men were dragged before him and executed. It was described as a day filled with shrieking, weeping, and wailing, as the Mongols systematically tortured the wealthiest citizens, forcing them to hand over their treasures. Estimates of the death toll vary, but the most chilling numbers suggest that between 700,000 and 1.3 million people were executed. Allegedly, Khan had ordered each of his soldiers to execute at least 300 individuals. The bloodshed at Merv set the tone for the brutality that would characterize many of Genghis Khan's campaigns. The Mongols continued their relentless march westward, and in the spring of the same year, they laid their eyes on Nishapur, a city in present-day Iran. The siege was every bit as hostile as Merv, with Mongol forces raining down fireballs and massive stones on the city's defenses. Once the city fell, bloody house-to-house fighting ensued, and those unlucky enough to survive the initial wave of violence were dragged out of hiding and executed. The Mongols, in a grim display of power, constructed 3 massive piles of skulls, one each for men, women, and children. Khan had made it clear that no trace of Nishapur was to remain, and his forces even exterminated the city's animals, dogs, cats, and vermin alike, ensuring that the city would be utterly cleansed. While 400 executed workers were spared to aid in the empire's growth, the remaining population of 170,000 was executed or enslaved. If that wasn't enough, the brutality of Genghis Khan also extended to personal vengeance. In the year 1219, after the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, had insulted Khan, the Mongol emperor launched a campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. Otrar fell after a 5-month siege, and Khan exacted a terrifying punishment on Inalchuk. According to some accounts, molten silver was poured into the governor's ears, eyes, and neck as a form of execution, an agonizing death meant to send a clear message to any who dared defy him. Once Otrar was captured, the Mongols didn't stop with the governor. The entire population of around 100,000 was brought out and executed. Meanwhile, at the Battle of Legnica in April of the year 1241, the Mongols demonstrated their ruthlessness once again. They had a chilling method for counting the dead. They severed the right ear of each slain enemy soldier. The severed ears filled 9 large sacks, an image that was both tragic and terrifying. This practice may have extended beyond Poland, as similar reports from Bulgaria and Russia suggest that thousands of ears were collected as trophies, further solidifying the Mongols' reputation for brutality. In the year 1220, the Mongols turned their attention to the city of Termez, in what is now Uzbekistan. Here, a woman begged for her life, claiming she had swallowed pearls. Her captors, insatiable in their pursuit of wealth, sliced open her body to retrieve the jewels. This incident prompted a cruel order from the Mongol commander to have the bodies of all Termez's citizens disemboweled, in hopes of finding similar riches hidden within their bodies. Cold and brutal. Despite his terrifying legacy, Genghis Khan's life came to an end in August of the year 1227. Before his death, he reportedly insisted that his burial site remain a closely guarded secret. Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer who ventured into the Mongol court decades later, recounted a chilling story of Khan's funeral. According to Polo, 2,000 slaves who worked on the burial were executed by their guards, who were in turn executed by another group of soldiers. These soldiers, to erase any trace of their actions, murdered anyone who might have witnessed the burial. After completing their bloody task, the soldiers reportedly took their own lives to ensure that no one would ever reveal the location of Genghis Khan's final resting place. Today, scholars believe that Genghis Khan's grave is most likely hidden in the sacred mountains of Burkhan Khaldun, deep in the north of Mongolia, though no one knows for sure. On to the history of another brutal siege. Number 3. Siege of Jerusalem by Titus. The Siege of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era was one of the most harrowing events in the history of the First Jewish Revolt. It marked the final brutal chapter of a 4-year campaign by the Romans to crush Jewish resistance in Judea. In April of 70 Common Era, just around the time of Passover, Roman General Titus began his siege of Jerusalem. Josephus, a Jewish historian and former rebel commander who defected to the Romans, is the primary source for much of what we know about this tragic event. According to him, the city became a scene of unimaginable suffering, murder, starvation, and even cannibalism. Titus's decision to let pilgrims enter Jerusalem for Passover but prevent them from leaving was a calculated move. This effectively trapped thousands of people inside the city, and with the city's food and water supplies running low, the situation grew desperate. Children began to die of hunger and thirst. Inside the walls, things were no better. The Zealots, a radical anti-Roman faction, fought bitterly against other Jewish groups, making it even harder to mount a unified defense. Josephus tried to mediate, hoping for a peaceful resolution, but his efforts failed. The Romans didn't trust him, and the rebels viewed him with disdain. Negotiations came to nothing, and the Romans encircled the city with a wall to cut off all supplies, effectively forcing all the residents into starvation. By August of 70 Common Era, after months of siege, the Romans finally broke through the city's defenses. What followed was a massacre on a horrific scale. The Romans executed much of the remaining population and destroyed the Second Temple, a monumental loss for the Jewish people. Today, the Western Wall is the only remaining piece of the temple, and it stands as a symbol of both mourning and faith. The destruction of the temple is still mourned annually by Jews on Tisha B'Av, a fast day that recalls the tragic event. Josephus's account of the siege is chilling. He claims that 1 million people were unalived during the siege, most of them Jews, and he blames the timing of Passover for the high death toll. Along with those who died in the violence, many more perished from disease and starvation. Josephus also tells us that after the unalivings, around 97,000 people were taken into slavery. Only about 40,000 survived the siege, and they were granted freedom to go wherever they wished, though their lives would never be the same. Another Roman historian, Tacitus, offered a different perspective, saying that around 600,000 people were trapped inside the city. In Tacitus's words, the defenders feared life under Roman rule more than they feared death, which drove them to resist to the bitter end. Everyone, from men to women, fought till their dying breath. The siege of Jerusalem was a turning point in Jewish history, not just because of the immense loss of life, but also because it signified the beginning of the long and painful exile of the Jewish people from their homeland, a sentiment that would be shared by residents of Constantinople in 1204. Number 2. Sack of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade's original mission was to reclaim the Holy Land. But in a terrifying diversion, the shocking attack on Constantinople in 1204 stands as one of the most infamous betrayals in medieval history. What began as a Christian effort against Muslim forces turned into a brutal display of greed and opportunism, leaving a permanent fracturing of the Byzantine Empire. The corruption of the Fourth Crusade began early. Struggling to pay the Republic of Venice for the transport of their forces eastward, the Crusaders found themselves indebted to their Venetian financiers. To settle this debt, they were coerced into attacking Zara, a Christian city under Hungarian control, on behalf of Venice. This initial act of betrayal set a troubling precedent. Meanwhile, an exiled Byzantine prince, Alexius Angelos, offered the Crusaders a tempting reward of gold and resources if they helped him reclaim the Byzantine throne. Enticed by this promise, the Crusaders turned their fleet toward Constantinople. In July of 1203, they succeeded in installing Alexius as co-emperor. However, his reign was short-lived. By February of 1204, Alexius had been overthrown and murdered. Replaced by Alexius Ducas, a Byzantine noble who quickly made it clear that the Crusaders were no longer welcome. Refusing to leave empty-handed, the Crusaders laid siege to Constantinople. The first assault on the city failed, resulting in heavy losses, but on the 12th of April, the Crusaders breached the city's defenses. Swarming up shipmasts and scrambling across makeshift catwalks, they reached the city walls. On the shore, others used picks and shovels to smash through a bricked-up gateway. Once a hole was made, Aliomes of Clary was the first to crawl through, finding the streets eerily deserted. As the hole was widened, hundreds of Crusaders poured into the city, eventually forcing open a main gate to let the rest of the army in. What followed was 3 days of wild chaos. The Crusaders destroyed the city at will, looting homes, businesses, and sacred sites. Churches, monasteries, and convents were desecrated. Altars were smashed apart for their gold and marble, while the Church of the Holy Apostles, containing the tombs of past Byzantine emperors, was thoroughly ransacked. Holy relics and priceless works of art were stolen, many of which were taken to Venice, where they remain to this day. Even the most sacred sanctuaries of the city were not spared, despite the Crusaders' vows and the threat of excommunication. By the time order was restored, the Crusader leadership organized a systematic looting of Constantinople, ensuring that every ounce of value was extracted. Though the civilian death toll was relatively low compared to other medieval sieges, with estimates of around 2,000 unalived, the psychological and cultural devastation was immense. Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, was left in ruins. The Venetians and Crusader leaders divided the spoils, and Baldwin of Flanders was installed as emperor. However, his reign was largely symbolic, as most Byzantines refused to accept him. The Byzantine Empire fractured into 4 rival states, weakening it beyond repair. Now onto our last story of ancient war crimes. Number 1. The destruction of Delhi. In 1398, Delhi faced one of the darkest chapters in its history. The city, once a symbol of power and wealth, became the target of Timur, a ruthless conqueror known for leaving destruction wherever he went. What happened next was not just a battle, but a horrifying massacre that left Delhi in ruins and its people devastated. At the time, Delhi was already struggling. Years of fighting between different rulers had left the city weak and vulnerable. But despite its troubles, it was still a rich and beautiful place, a prize too tempting for Timur to ignore. He didn't just want to conquer Delhi, he wanted to send a terrifying message to the world about his power. Timur's army marched over 1,000 miles from his home in Samarkand to reach Delhi. By the time they arrived in December, his soldiers were tired, but their hunger for victory and loot drove them forward. Facing him was Sultan Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud, who commanded an army that included war elephants covered in armor. It should have been a strong defense, but the Sultan made a huge mistake. He decided to leave the safety of the city walls and face Timur in open battle. Timur was a brilliant strategist, and he quickly took advantage of this error. The Sultan's army was defeated in a crushing battle. But what Timur did next was far worse. Before attacking the city itself, he ordered his soldiers to execute over 100,000 prisoners, people he had captured during his campaign. He claimed this was necessary because he didn't want them turning against him. The prisoners were massacred, their bodies dumped in piles, all as a horrifying warning to survivors hiding in Delhi. When Timur's forces entered the city, the real nightmare began. His soldiers rampaged through the streets, unaliving anyone they found. They set homes and temples on fire, stole treasures, and tore apart everything that made Delhi a great city. The mass execution was so brutal that the streets were said to be blocked with dead bodies. For 3 days, Timur's men looted and destroyed, showing no mercy to the people who lived there. By the time Timur and his army left, Delhi was unrecognizable. The once bustling city was now a wasteland. Most of its people were either dead or taken as slaves, and the survivors were left to live among the ruins. It took years for Delhi to recover from the devastation, and even today, the memory of Timur's attack serves as a grim reminder of the cruelty that can come with war. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.